This week, we find ourselves back in Mark's Gospel. We're in the 5th chapter now. And at the front end, this feels like a pretty standard Mark miracle story. Think about last week, halfway through chapter 4. Jesus and some disciples are on a boat. A storm rolls in. The boat is becoming swamped. They're fearful. They wake up Jesus. Jesus quells the storm, and then everybody's fine. It's a very straightforward pattern. People are fearful. They get Jesus. Jesus solves the issue, protects the people, gets them through the danger, and then they continue. We see this throughout the 19 chapters of Mark's Gospel. Mark, who writes in this very quick way, in this immediate way, actually doesn't spend a lot of time describing too many additional details to this miracle or these miracles throughout his Gospel. And so when our Gospel reading starts today, we find something that at first seems very similar. There's a man named Jairus who's a leader in the synagogue. Jairus has a daughter who we find out is 12 years old. She is sick and near death. So Jairus, obviously a faithful man, goes out of his way to find Jesus, throws himself at Jesus' feet, and says, "I need you to come and touch my daughter. Lay your hands on her so she may live." Jesus hears his request and then goes with him to find his daughter. Everything is following an expected trajectory. But then something happens. This very simple miracle story gets interrupted. Jairus' quest gets put on pause when a woman who has been hemorrhaging for 12 years works her way through the crowd and touches the hem of Jesus' garment. Jesus feels power leave from him and asks the disciples, "Who touched me?" They say, "Jesus, you're surrounded by people. It could be any of them." And the situation plays out. Jairus' story is paused. It's interrupted by this woman's healing. Now, this past Wednesday at Bible study, we took a lot of time and spent a lot of effort on looking at the connections between the woman with the hemorrhages for 12 years and Jairus' daughter, right? Jairus is a faithful person who comes looking for Jesus, hoping and believing and knowing that Jesus could heal his daughter. The woman with hemorrhages also believes that Jesus may be the miraculous answer to her situation and goes out and finds him. Jairus' daughter is 12 years old. The hemorrhaging woman has been hemorrhaging for 12 years. We can also see big differences. Jairus is a leader in the synagogue. This woman has been hemorrhaging for 10 years, therefore been probably pushed to the sides of society, ostracized, deemed as unclean. And they both come from different situations. One ostracized in a community, another a leader in a synagogue. And yet, both are healed, or if not healed themselves, in the case of Jairus, have those who they care about being healed. The story is about Jairus' daughter. In the other story, Jesus calls the woman who has been hemorrhaging for 12 years, he calls her daughter. There are so many connections between these two stories. But today, instead of looking at these connections or deep diving on any of those, I'd like to focus on something else. I'd like to focus on the time signature, if you will, of the experiences of Jairus and the hemorrhaging woman. Let me take a step back. A few weeks ago, I took a week's vacation and went to North Carolina. I spent the week primarily with my mom there in Morrisville. That Friday, I drove her to Fayetteville, North Carolina, where she grew up, to visit a friend of hers. And I love taking my mom to Fayetteville because Fayetteville is where she grew up, and she knows those roads like the back of her hand. I love getting to Fayetteville and turning off the GPS and having my mom tell me where to go. My mom is totally blind but lost her sight during her mid to late 30s, and still she can give turn-by-turn directions through Fayetteville, North Carolina better than any cell phone or GPS, though she will always do it with the caveat, now, unless they put in a new light or a new road, in 3 streets you're going to turn this way or that. And so we went to Fayetteville, North Carolina, and we went to Lafayette Cemetery, which is where my father was buried in 2022. It's also where Mama and Papa are buried. Mama and Papa are what we call my mom's parents, my maternal grandfather and grandmother. And Lafayette Cemetery is across the street from the VA where my grandfather used to work, and about 1.5 miles from Sherman Drive, which is the road that my mom grew up on, in a little brick house on top of a hill. And so we were leaving the cemetery, and we went down the road and turned left and then veered right and found ourselves on Sherman Drive, and we drove past the house where my mother spent the majority of her childhood, her middle school years, her high school years, where she grew up. And the last time I remember seeing that house is prior to 1990, through my eyes as a child under the age of 11. And now, as a 42-year-old in 2024, the house looked different, to say the least. But it was a beautiful flood of memories from my childhood driving by it. There it was, brick house on a hill, the front yard slanted down, and my mother told the story that she loves to tell about how Papa, when he would cut the grass, would tie a rope around the lawnmower so he could lower the lawnmower down the hill and then pull it back up to make sure to cut all the grass. And the house there, built on a hill, the hill is under 2/3 of the house, but the other part of the house, underneath where the dining room and the kitchen would be, they had a garage built in. And in their car, on the visor, they had a clicker because they would turn off of Sherman Drive, turn up the driveway, and hit the clicker, and the clicker would open the garage. I feel like Mama and Papa were the first people I ever knew who had a garage. And sometimes when we were going back to their house, especially if Mama was driving and I was the only one in the car, she would let me hit the clicker button to open the garage. What a special treat that was. And so I kept thinking about Mama and Papa and the times that I remember being in that house and the times I remember traveling around Fayetteville with Mama, especially in the summers. And I started thinking about her car. Their car, I should say. And I don't remember the model or the make, but I remember certain things about it. I remember the very long bench seats in the front and in the back. I remember the pure metal seatbelt buckles that got so hot in the North Carolina summers. And I remember the sound of the turn signal. Because in our car, the sound of the turn signal was one note. It was like bing, 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 bing. But in Mama and Papa's car, the sound of the turn signal had, well, it made two different tones. It made a sound more like a click, clock, click, clock, click, clock, click, clock. Like the sound of a grandfather clock just coming from the dashboard. Now, here's what I think's interesting. Did you know that there's a way to increase the speed and to change the sound of your turn signal in your car? There is. It's actually quite simple. The way you do it is become late or rushed or fearful or frantic. Think about the feeling of being told that a loved one or family member is in the ER and you have to get there as fast as you can, and then you get stuck behind a red light and turn on your blinker waiting to make that left. Suddenly, it'll go from click, clock, click, clock to click, clock, click, clock, click, clock, click, clock. Or if you're rushing somewhere that you don't want to be late to and get stuck behind a slow driver and you have to wait on them to make the turn and you turn that turn signal on, click, clock, click, clock, click, clock, click, clock. Or I remember coming back from the pool, needing to make that left-hand turn to get to Mama's house because I should have went to the restroom like she told me before we left, but I didn't. And I needed to get in the house so bad. And that two-tone sound, click, clock, click, clock, click, clock, click, clock, became so fast as I was frantically waiting and praying for the car in the other lane to drive by so we could make the left, go up the driveway, hit the button on the clicker, get in the garage, and I could get in the house. In today's gospel reading, Jairus has a daughter who is deathly ill. So he goes and finds Jesus. Click, clock, click, clock. This is a normal timing. He has a problem. He knows Jesus will be there. He's a faithful person who goes to find Jesus. And then they turn and go back to Jairus' house. At least they start that journey. But then they are interrupted by the woman who's been hemorrhaging, by this person in the crowd who has touched Jesus. And suddenly, Jairus' story is put on pause. So in his mind, it becomes frantic. But we were going there. Suddenly, the sound of the blinker in his head, if you will, goes from click, clock, to click, clock, click, clock, click, clock, click, clock. But why are we stopping? Why are you talking to her? My daughter is ill. When if we think about it from the other side, this woman who has been hemorrhaging for 12 years, who has been taken advantage of by physicians, who has run out of money, who has been ostracized for 12 years at least, who has woken up every morning, click, clock, what am I going to do? How can I be healed? How do I get out of this? Has woken up early and come into town and picked her position, and finally, Jesus is coming. She may be able to touch just the hem of his garment to be healed. Click, clock, makes her way up, touches him, and feels the healing in her body. And in that moment, her story slows down. What I think is beautiful in this text is that between Jairus and the hemorrhaging woman, we have two different stories of people whose time signatures seem to cross one another in their experience with Jesus. Jairus starts off calm, but grows frantic as time is being spent with this woman, as this woman has come in frantic, but then slows down to speak to Jesus after she receives her healing. Both of them, or both of those that they love, both the hemorrhaging woman and Jairus' daughter, are healed, regardless of if they felt frantic or calm or both and. I feel like the most challenging verse in Mark's gospel is also in this text. It's later on in the house when Jesus says to the people there, "She is not dead, but she is sleeping." A comment Jesus makes to undermine the situation or to devalue it or to de-stress the people or to get them to not worry. But in that reality, he's undermining the importance of what is actually happening. The girl is dead, and Jesus resurrects her. I don't believe we should downplay the power of what God is doing in Jesus, who is the Christ. I don't think that inviting people to church because it's not a big deal is a good invitation. I don't like how Jesus says, "She's not dead, just sleeping," belittling the power and the action of what he is doing. I don't think when we consider the time signatures of Jairus and the hemorrhaging woman that the point of the story is that Jesus shows up in the nick of time, like Jesus barely squeaks it in right there at the last minute. The power of this story is that Christ is coming, that Christ has come and will come again. That in Christ we see the power of what God is doing for us and the entire world on God's time. Whether we are upset or frantic or cool as a cucumber, Christ is coming on God's time, and the power of that is in the proclamation that Christ will come again. In many ways, friends, I think this is an Advent story. It is a story about coming. It is a story about waiting. It is a story that reminds us of the truth and the power that whether we are waiting, click, clock, or if our lives, for whatever reason that we know day to day, feel more frantic, more click, clock, either way, the truth is in the powerful proclamation that Jesus is coming for you and for me and for all of creation. Thanks be to God.